Thank you, Madam Toastmaster and fellow Toastmasters, for that warm introduction, Toastmaster. It's a pleasure to be here in front of you today, to be able to speak with you and introduce myself a little bit further to you all, and talk to you about a topic that's very important to me, and that's the topic of fear. Now, as many of you may already know, and for those of you who don't know, my name is Art. I'm a 35-year-old Marine Corps helicopter pilot. I'm here studying operations research at the Naval Postgraduate School. But more than that, I'm someone who's very interested in the topic of fear. Now, if I can share something with you very briefly, I come from a very violent and abusive childhood. And I say that not to make this a form of catharsis, because I don't think that's what it is. I think it's a form of self-improvement, and that's why I'm here. That background has held me back a lot from communicating with people. It's held me back in personal relationships, and namely, it's held me back because of fear. I was afraid that if people knew what background I came from, they would immediately judge you negatively. And so I've struggled with that. And the reason I'm here in front of you all and as part of this club is to deal with that, is to become integrated with that fear. Now, I'm not sure all of us can relate to having a violent childhood, but I think all of us, maybe with the exception of Carl, but he's not here, can relate to maybe not feeling accepted. When we get up, we take our booty up in front of someone and we start to speak in front of an audience, we really start to question whether or not we're going to be accepted by that audience. So it's something I think that we all as communicators can benefit from, and I know that I'm really trying to benefit from integrating fear in my life. So I want to talk to you about three things on the topic of fear today. I want to talk to you about a definition of fear. I'd also like to talk to you about common fears that we all have, and then I'd like to talk to you just briefly about maybe some of the neurobiology associated with fear, just to kind of whet your appetite on the topic, and maybe fill you in on some things that you didn't know. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the definition of fear. Now, if you look the definition up in any textbook, you'll see something akin to the following, and that fear is a physiological or a feeling in response to a perceived threat. My favorite part of that definition is the word perceived. You know, in my line of work, people like to say perception is reality. And you got to be very careful with that definition because of two things. Perception is rarely true, first of all, and neither is it complete. So another friend likes to tell me, hey, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that everybody isn't out to get you. And you know, as amusing as that is, the point I get from that is that fear is something that is perceived, and sometimes our perception of things isn't 100% accurate. So it's important to look at it, register it, and then evaluate it for its legitimacy. Now, what are fears? There's a lot of fears out there, and recently a man by the name of Tom Dancer put together a top 10 list of fears that Americans have, and he did so on the basis of web searches. He correlated the frequency of web searches to common fears that are out there amongst people, and I'd like to share a few of those with you today. In descending order, we as Americans have a fear of flying, first of all, which makes sense, and then closely behind that is a fear of heights. Now, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to number 3, the fear of clowns. I know that I'm very afraid of clowns. I think that's a very strange one. Behind the fear of clowns is the fear of intimacy, and behind the fear of intimacy is the fear of death. We're more afraid of being intimate than we are of dying. So as amusing as these are, the point is that fears are very common amongst a lot of people. We all share them. It's important to kind of register them and integrate them in ourselves and see them for what they are. And finally, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about where fear comes from in the brain. Now, I'm just going to hit wave tops, or a quick wave top of what the neuroscience of fear is. And it comes from a portion of the brain called the amygdala. Now, I'm going to recommend a book to you guys called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. If you haven't read this book, it's a tremendous book. And he talks a lot about the advances in neuroscience over the last 50 years, specifically the amygdala. It's a small portion of the brain responsible for processing negative emotions, such as fear. Now, what's fascinating is you'll see in the course of his research and the advancements that have been made in neuroscience that in the course of studying the amygdala, they've realized that people who have a conscious association with their fear, or they recognize it, have less activity in their amygdala than those who are trying to put it away or not recognize it. Now that's amazing. That's kind of counterintuitive because we feel like if we're afraid, we should compartmentalize it. We shouldn't face it, right? But that's exactly the opposite. We should face it. we should be conscious of it because it actually lessens the effect of it and it helps us overcome it. So that's not necessarily intuitive, but that's very valuable information. So to bring it all back home, I'm here as someone who wants to learn more about fear and integrate it as I'm trying to communicate with people. I've talked to you a little bit about the definition of fear. I've talked to you about some of the humorous common fears that we have, to include clowns, don't forget that one. And I've also talked briefly about some of the neuroscience wave top aspects of fear. So with that, I hope I've given you something to think about in terms of fear.